Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 2022 Year 8 Division Debating Essay Grand Final Debate. My name is Laura Manning, and I am the chairman of this debate. The timekeeper is Ared Rosé. The topic for this debate is that private schools should be abolished. The affirmative team seated to my right is from Aberfoyle Park High School, consisting of first speaker Jessica Thornhill, second speaker Amina Anklis, and third speaker Abhinav Moragappa. The negative team seated to my left is from Glenunga International High School, consisting of first speaker Jordan Mason, second speaker Kaylin Mason, and third speaker Aijan Thota. The grand final debate will be judged by a panel of 5 adjudicators, who are Ms. Boyd Turner, Mr. Morton, Ms. France, Mr. Hazel, and Ms. Zabo. The speaking time of this debate is 4 minutes. A single warning bell will sound at 3 minutes, and a double bell will sound at 4 minutes. A continuous bell may be rung 30 seconds after the speaking time, in which case the speaker must sit down immediately. Please switch off your mobile phones and other electronic devices. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Jessica Thornhill.
Good morning, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for this debate is that private schools should be abolished. We define the term private school as a school founded and maintained by a private group rather than by the government. We define the word abolish as formally putting an end to the existence of private schools. We interpret the topic overall as the nationalisation of private schools within Australia, which would result in the transfer of all private schools into government schools. We, the affirmative team, strongly support this movement, and today we will argue why. Today, as first speaker, I'll contend that the nationalisation of schools is necessary for our social and economic development, and argue how private schools maintain, privilege, and perpetuate inequalities. Our second speaker will discuss the funding inequalities between both public and private schools and explain the cause and impact of this. Our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team's case. My first point is that private schooling perpetuates inequalities. Principle 7 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of a Child states that a child shall be given an education on a basis of equal opportunity. We, the affirmative team, see that private schooling diminishes the United Nations notion of equal opportunity in schooling, as it sustains the problematic idea of a genetic lottery where a parent's socio-economic position determines their child's educational opportunities. This is highly problematic because it prevents social mobility. According to Robert G. Stone, Professor of Sociology at Harvard University, the ability to break the boundary of your social class is a critical factor in a healthy society. By tying educational opportunities to one's financial status, these societal boundaries cannot be overcome. Abolishing private schools would create an education of equal opportunity by standardising resources. This new system would not favour anyone due to their socio-economic position or promote the genetic lottery, meaning that no child would have a head start just because of their financial status. This leads to my second point, that private schools maintain privilege. A study conducted by educational organisation Sutton Trust found an alarming overrepresentation of privately educated people in better universities and in key professional careers that shape our society, such as journalism, law, politics, and finance. This is despite the fact that, according to recent studies done by the Programme of International Student Assessment, when accounting for socioeconomic factors, students attending public schools achieved on average better results in writing, reading, and mathematics, while here in Australia, 8 out of the top 10 schools by HSC ATAR results were public. So, even though our public school students are outperforming their private school peers academically, it is the privately educated graduates that are dominating the most influential sectors. Why is this so? Well, according to Sutton Trust, this dominance is a result of private school students leveraging their social capital. Social capital, in this context, refers to the networks of relationships among students that enables them to become better connected to affluent members of society. This creates disadvantage, as it gives affluent students a network of privileged social contacts, a network not available to those in the public system. Ladies and gentlemen, we recognise that we cannot abolish class systems, but we can change structures that promote privilege. We acknowledge that, like with any change, it will create division. For example, the negative may try to argue that this revokes parents' rights to the type of education their child receives. And naturally, people react passionately when they feel their individual choice is being compromised. But we need to ask ourselves, as a progressive society, are we willing to shed privilege to safeguard equality of opportunity? So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, we believe the abolishment of private schools is necessary for the nation's social and economic development. Thank you.
I call upon the first negative speaker, Jordan Mason.
Good morning, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Today's debate topic is that private schools should be abolished. As the negative team, we strongly disagree with this statement and agree with the affirmative team's definition of the topic. This morning, as the negative team's first speaker, I shall be discussing how abolishing private schools would place a gargantuan financial burden on the government and consequently would be detrimental to Australian society. I will also explain how this action would force students into the public schooling system and further perpetuate Australia's housing crisis. Our second speaker will be presenting the arguments that there should be a multitude of choices when it comes to educational institutions to suit different family circumstances, religious and cultural beliefs, and individual needs. And finally, our third speaker will firmly rebut and summarise our team's case. Before I proceed to my arguments, I would like to highlight the flaws in the affirmative team's claims. The first affirmative speaker stated that private schools create egalitarian social networks and education. Class distinction will exist regardless of schooling. It would be extremely naive to believe that these networks would dissipate if privileged children were schooled by the state. There are advantages to these networks that far outweigh these ideals. Without the established connections and name recognition that comes along with having a private education, many businesses would never be funded, deals would fail to materialise, and industry would not run as smoothly. Jobs are created and value added to society based on these networks. I shall now proceed to my first point. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, 65.1% of Australian students are enrolled in public schools, compared to 34.9% in private. ABC News states the government currently pays public schools the full amount it costs to educate a child, approximately $13,700 per student, whilst private school funding is a percentage based on the government's perception of how much the school can raise from fees and other sources. The Bureau of Statistics states that of the 4 million students enrolled in schools nationally, 1.4 million of these are private school students. This means that if private schools were abolished, the federal government would have to fund an additional $19.3 billion every single year for these transferring students, on top of $36 billion for existing public school students. This would disadvantage society, as these additional funds would need to be raised through increasing taxes or funneling funds from other essential areas, such as health or aged care. I will now address my second point. If private schools were abolished, approximately 1.4 million students would need to be accommodated in public schools. And because many parents place a premium on enrolling their children in high-performing schools, they would seek to satisfy entry requirements by residing within specific school zones. The Real Estate Journal found a direct connection between house prices and school zones, with the Financial Review revealing that in every capital city of Australia, the cost of acquiring a house in a highly desired school zone has increased by up to 60% over the past 3 years. With the competition for houses creating an undersupply issue, the event adds fuel to the already raging fire that is the Australian housing crisis. So, at a time when affordability and accessibility is already out of reach for so many families, does it make sense to abolish private schools and further perpetuate this crisis? Thus, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, we, the negative team, strongly believe that private schools should not be abolished, as it would not only burden the government and society, but would also disadvantage students by forcing them into the public system, and consequently exacerbates the housing crisis. As the great leader Malcolm X once stated, education is the passport to future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare it today. Thank you.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Amina Anklis.
Good morning, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for this debate is that private schools should be abolished. We, the affirmative team, firmly agree with this statement. The first speaker has attempted to argue that by abolishing private schools, it would not only be costly, but this would represent an ineffective use of state resources and reduce educational inequality. The government already pours $96 million annually into the private school system, and the benefits of this outlay is limited to people who are already of a high socioeconomic bracket. And while we acknowledge that the nationalisation of private schools would be costly, we as the affirmative team strongly believe that the benefits outweigh the costs associated with said nationalisation. Our first speaker has already contended that the abolishment of private schools is necessary to ensure the nation's social and economic development. I will further elaborate by arguing 2 points. My first point is that there is inequity between the ways private and public schools are funded, which robs government schools of essential resources. According to The Guardian, government funding for private schools in Australia has increased at nearly 5 times the rate of public school funding over the past 10 years, creating a $74 billion shortfall in money for public schools this decade. Funding for private schools increased by $3,338 per student, adjusted for inflation, compared with only $703 per student for public schools. Why are private schools that already receive school fees and donations given more government funding than government schools? According to ABC News, the post-war baby boom put a huge strain on all schools, and Catholic schools were given more funding to meet the students' needs. According to Glenn Savage, Senior Lecturer in Educational Policy at the University of Melbourne, that solution was put in place in the 1970s and has had repercussions that we have never moved away from, despite the extreme wealth now within the private school sector. The article aforementioned assert, in 2010, the government engaged businessman David Gonski to lead a review into Australia's school funding, with the aim of reducing the impact of social disadvantage on educational outcomes and ending inequities in the distribution of public money. The report recommended that governments reduce payments to overfunded schools and redirect funds on a needs-based model. But a decade on, as mentioned, private schools receive well above their benchmark, and public schools are suffering as a result. Therefore, the abolishment of private schools will ensure taxpayer contributions are equitably distributed, as funds for public schools are not being allocated to the private sector. This leads to my second point, that private schools foster elitism that undermines democratic institutions by promoting class segregation. The Harvard professor of political philosophy, Michael Sandel, raised his concerns about private schools by stating, "We live, work, shop, and play in different places. Our children go to different schools. This is not good for democracy, nor is it a satisfactory way to live." Democracy doesn't require perfect equality, but it does require that citizens share a common life. There appears to be a growing political consensus that we do not live in a cohesive society, but in many fractured and segregated communities. The abolishment of private schools would be the first step in unifying our socio-political divide and thereby safeguard the principle of representation that is so integral to our democratic institutions. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, We, as the affirmative team, are unfaltering in our belief that private schools need to be abolished to allow for a more fair and just education system. Thank you.
I call upon the second negative speaker, Kaylin Mason.
Good morning, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. This morning's debate topic is that private schools should be abolished. As the negative team, we wholeheartedly disagree with this statement. I should be arguing that in our modern society and in accordance with human rights law, there should be a range of schools to suit different religious and cultural beliefs as well as individual needs. However, before I proceed, I'd like to highlight some flaws in the opposition's claims. The second affirmative speaker stated that private schools are draining funding from public schools. On the contrary, parents of children in private schools are taxpayers. The proportion of their tax that goes into the government funding of education is the same that for the parents of children in public schools. Yet the parents of private school students receive a much smaller proportion of this back in the form of education services. The remainder of their tax stays in the public system. These parents, because they prefer not to send their children to a public school, are faced with further out-of-pocket expenses for school fees. Therefore, they pay for their children's education twice, and in doing so, they are effectively subsidising the public system. Now, to my first point. Just as we have the choice of eating organic over non-organic food, purchasing a Ferrari over a Toyota, Australian parents should have the choice of sending their children to a school that they feel best suits their children's and families' interests and or needs. Whether they want to provide their children with a religious education or enrol them in a more specialised school that focuses on their particular needs. We contend that this should continue to be at every parent's discretion. But this is not just a moral argument, it is also a matter of human rights law. The abolition of private schools would be in breach of the 1998 Commonwealth Human Rights Act, which states that parents should have the right to choose schools that correspond with their religious beliefs. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Australia is a signatory, also states that the freedom to manifest religious beliefs includes the freedom to establish religious schools. Public schools are forbidden by law in Australia from promoting any religious practices or beliefs. Therefore, abolishing private schools would remove a parent's right to choose a religious education for their children. This would be discriminatory towards those in our community who hold religious beliefs, and history has demonstrated just how dangerous and destabilising discrimination on the grounds of religion can be for our society. Now, on to my second point. The Fraser Institute conducted a study which identified that the primary reasons parents chose private schools over public schools were smaller class sizes, dedicated teachers, emphasis on academic quality, and an additional level of safety. Statistics comparing Year 8's test results from public and private schools have also found that private school students were 1.5 times less likely to fail a test or course. According to the data from OECD's Programme for International Assessments, a key factor in the difference in scores was the high proportion of highly qualified teachers at private schools, including that almost 10% more teachers in private schools have a master's degree. Also, let us not forget that many rural families rely on the private boarding system to access educational opportunities that they wouldn't have if they were to remain at home. What would happen to these students if we abolished private schools? Thus, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, private schools should not be abolished because this would be in violation of basic human rights and Australian parents should continue to have the choice to invest in the education that they choose for their children, be that public or private. As the great Nelson Mandela once stated, to deny people of their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. Thank you.
I call upon the third affirmative speaker, Aberfoyle.
Good morning, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate is that private schools should be abolished. We, the affirmative team, strongly agree with this statement. I'll now move on to my rebuttal. The first negative speaker has attempted to argue that by abolishing private schools, it would not only be costly, but represents an ineffective use of state resources to reduce educational inequality. We, as the affirmative team, believe that the benefits of nationalizing private schools outweigh the costs associated with said nationalization. According to Dana Mitra, Associate Professor of Education at Pennsylvania State University, a population that is better educated has less unemployment, reduced dependence on public assistance programs, and greater tax revenue. She also states that education plays a key role in the reduction of crime, improved public health, and greater political and civic engagement. As we have argued, nationalizing private schools and improving the standards of public education will result in a very effective use of state resources to reduce educational inequality. The second speaker has attempted to argue that by abolishing private schools, we would be breaking the 1998 Human Rights Act, which includes a provision guaranteeing the right for parents to educate their children in accordance with their religious and philosophical beliefs. However, the jurisdiction of the cited Human Rights Act must be taken into consideration. Australia has ratified almost all the major international human rights instruments conceived by the United Nations, whereas the 1998 Human Rights Act is enshrined in the European Covenant on Human Rights and UK Commission on Human Rights Charter, which Australia has not ratified. This signifies the clauses of the cited Act are not legally enforceable in the Australian jurisdiction, which regards the opposition's argument null. The second negative speaker has also attempted to argue that private schools offer more individualized learning due to smaller class sizes, allowing students to have a more personalized learning experience. The common belief is that private schools have smaller class sizes is a misconception. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the student-to-teaching staff ratio in private schools in 2021 was 12.8 students to 1 teacher, whereas in government schools, the student-to-teaching staff ratio was 13.6 students to a teacher. This translates to almost 1 extra student per teacher in public schools. Ladies and gentlemen, do you think 1 extra student per teacher is going to affect the learning experience of students in public and private schools? We, as an affirmative team, argue otherwise. I'll now move on to my summary. Our first speaker argued that the nationalization of schools is necessary for our social and economic development, and argued how private schools maintain privilege and perpetuate inequality. Our second speaker argued that there is an inequity between the ways private and public schools are funded, thereby robbing state schools of essential resources. She further supported our position by arguing that private schools foster elitism that undermines democratic institutions by promoting class segregation. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, just think of all the people who wanted to be doctors, or lawyers, or engineers, but were never granted a quality education that enabled these dreams to be fulfilled. Many are now stuck in low-paying jobs, reinforcing the cycle of privilege and elitism that deny our economy the kind of growth a truly meritocratic system would create. Therefore, we as the affirmative team are unfaltering in our belief that private schools need to be abolished to allow for a far more just and fair education system. Thank you.
I call upon the third negative speaker, Ishan Thota.
Good morning, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight's debate topic is that private schools should be abolished. We, the negative team, are in unequivocal disagreement with this statement. As the third speaker, I will rebut and summarise our team's case. To begin with, I would like to point out some flaws in the opposition's arguments. The first affirmative speaker stated that private schools only provide choice for those who can pay for it. Parents who choose to send their children to a fee-paying school are making the best option for their children. They resolve to use the money they have required to provide the finest chances for their children in life. Who has the authority to advise someone else to spend their money, how to spend their money? Private schools provide parents an option to the public school system, as well as a learning environment that may be more suitable for their children. They are just spending their money to assist their children. Furthermore, while there are many awful public schools, there are also many bad private schools, and some exceptional public schools that compete with the top private schools. The second affirmative speaker stated that private schools are for the elite, rich, or privileged. The Australian Bureau of Statistics census numbers show that this is not the case. In reality, 21% of all students in public schools and 27% of all students in Catholic schools come from the highest income households, whilst the remaining 52% of families in the private system fall in between the low and high income groups. As a result, the generalization that private school students have wealthy parents and public school kids have impoverished parents is false. Although the balance of students in private schools is skewed towards higher income households, both public and private schools contain a large percentage of kids from all socioeconomic levels. According to cia.org.au, parents of private school pupils frequently work a second job to help pay for school costs. Our first speaker elucidated that the abolition of private schools would only increase the financial stress on the nation and negatively affect Australian society. He explained that the strenuous situation public schools are already in continues to deteriorate, and the supplementing and redirecting of private school students into the public sector is an unrealistic assignment for the government to handle. Private schools are given disproportionate funding in regards to their student body, but still operate extremely successfully. This is because government funding is a prerequisite for all state-operated educational establishments. The subsidising of operating fees through student enrolment prices is of key prominence in economically precarious times such as these, and this is what private schools have been able to accomplish with outstanding success. Our first speaker also explained that the abolition of private schools would indubitably perpetuate Australia's dire housing situation by forcing the parents of children attending private schools to pay premium prices to monopolise housing in already sought-for areas to guarantee their child the best possible education. Our second speaker elucidated that by abolishing private schools would be contradictory to the 1998 Human Rights Act and be limiting students' educational opportunities, whilst also restricting their ability to attend a religious school. This infringement of basic human rights would indubitably result in massive outrage due to the atrocity and egregious flagrancy of it. Our second speaker also stated that abolishing private schools would prevent families from investing in a better future for their children. It is unambiguous and irrefutable that students in a private school are given opportunities otherwise not possible at a state-operated public establishment, and it is of utmost importance that those who have the constitutional right to take advantage of it do so. Thus, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is evident that private schools should not be abolished, as their right to exist is constitutional and is protected by the very government whose schools, according to the opposition, should completely replace the existing private schools with almost 2 centuries of history in Australian society. Need I remind you of the great Maimonides' words? Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Teaching is the greatest gift anyone can give, and by abolishing private schools, we are unconstitutionally denying children the right to learn. Thank you.
I call upon a representative of the adjudication panel to come forward and award the debate.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Another very close decision, split 3-2. The debate was awarded to the negative team.
I call upon a member of the runner-up team to give a vote of thanks.
I'd just like to thank the opposition for putting up such a good debate tonight, and for all the teams that have made it to the grand finals. I'd like to thank the audience for coming here and watching our debates, the panel of judges for marking and scoring our debates, and the government, the Australian government, for providing us with such a wonderful space to do our grand final debate in.
I call upon a member of the winning team from the second vote of thanks.
First off, I'd like to thank Aberfoyle Park for putting up a great debate with really strong arguments and rebuttals. I'd like to thank the chairman and timekeeper and the wonderful panel of adjudicators, and also our wonderful coach, Mr. Bilski, for assisting us in the creation of our speeches and just looking over them for us. I'd also like to thank parents, caregivers and friends for coming to attend and watch us perform in this debate. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attendance. I now declare this debate closed.